attached to the dossier will be approved tomorrow at 10 a.m., either in its current wording or with any changes requested before that deadline to the Secretariat. Dear colleagues, our exchange of views today will focus on the repercussions of the ongoing war on the population in Gaza and in the West Bank and Jerusalem. For this discussion, we have the pleasure to have with us remotely Ms. Francesca Albanesse, UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. I thank her for her kind availability. Dear colleagues, before I give the floor to Ms. Albanesse, allow me to say a very few words. I'll be very brief. 2 months of an ongoing devastating war have resulted in an unprecedented humanitarian disaster in Gaza. As United Nations top officials have repeatedly stated, nowhere is safe in Gaza. No hospitals, no shelters, no refugee camps. No one is safe. Not even children, not health workers, not humanitarian workers. Such blatant disregard for basic humanity must stop. The war must stop. And that's what others have said. I'm quoting them. According to UNRWA, nearly 1.9 million people in Gaza, or nearly 85% of the population, are estimated to be internally displaced. The UN World Food Programme warned that the resumption of hostilities in Gaza will only intensify the catastrophic hunger crisis that already threatens to overwhelm the civilian population. The United Nations Human Rights Office has been clear. The pattern of attacks that target or impact civilian infrastructure raises serious concerns about Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law and significantly raises the risk of atrocity crimes. Furthermore, since the 7th of October, violence against Palestinians and casualties in and around the West Bank have dramatically increased. Since the 7th of October, OCHA has recorded 318 settler attacks against Palestinians. In nearly half of all recorded incidents, Israeli forces were either accompanying or reportedly seen as supporting the attackers. Since the 7th of October, at least 143 Palestinian households comprising 1,014 people, including 388 children, have been displaced amid settler violence and access restrictions. Last week, the Commissioner on EU Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid, Janek Lenarczyk, condemning the demolition by Israeli settlers of the EU-funded school in the Palestinian village of Zamuta, stressed that this destruction is intolerable and a violation of international humanitarian law. Allow me to remind you that through its resolutions, the European Parliament has called on the EU and its member states to support all initiatives aimed at upholding accountability for violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. I reiterate this call, and I therefore ask from the EU and the national governments to react accordingly against these perpetrators. Now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Albanesse, if she's connected.
Sí, no se te oye.
Yes, we can't hear you. Could you turn on your microphone, please?
I'm trying.
No.
No, we still can't hear you.
Hear me now.
Ahora.
Yes, now we can.
Bueno, lo primero.
Yes. First of all, Francesca, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you, Francesca.
It's done by the administration. I'm not touching anything.
Pero se oye, ¿cómo va con lo... ¿Va bien?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
So, yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be with you, even if only remotely. Yes, I would like to, first of all, to thank the Member of Parliament, Manu Pineda, for convening this meeting and for all of you who are present today. It's a very unfortunate moment, even in the history of Israel-occupied Palestinian territory, which is regularly unfortunate. and I'm happy to provide some details and yeah, give some context to what's happening. Can you still hear me? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I normally start by saying the 7th of October has been a tragic moment in the history of this tormented land and tormented people. But just for the sake of context, I want to start with the prior to the 7th of October, because of also some moves, some statements that I hear from European countries. And European countries do not like being accused of double standards. But this is what they do, practicing double standards through and through. And I would like to remind everyone that the state of Israel has been occupying militarily and therefore illegally, because a military occupation cannot last in perpetuity, has occupied militarily the land that should have become the state of Palestine, independent and sovereign state, for 56 plus years, establishing colonies after colonies that are war crimes in and of themselves, and forcing people to leave their lands and their homes, which have been progressively taken one by one, inch by inch. Yes, of course. And there has been the destruction of civilian infrastructure that was built with European taxpayers' money and has never been accounted for by the occupying power. So the occupying power, instead of paying for the expenses it had to provide for the needs of the occupied population, has been given carte blanche of doing whatever it pleased. And myself, including with my predecessors, Professor Michael Link, Professor Richard Falk, Professor John Dugard, we have alerted the international community that this would lead to an apocalyptic failure of the international community's ability to prevent violence and to preserve peace and stability. And with us, many human rights organizations in Palestine, in Israel, and internationally have said the same thing. No one has followed suit, meaning in the sense that on top of condemning, maybe it was opportune to consider some actions, diplomatic, economic, to ensure respect for international law. This was prior years during which also 1 million Palestinians, protected persons, have been arrested and detained, and without excusing any Palestinians, without condoning any crimes that might have been committed against Israelis and Israeli civilians during these 56 years of military occupation. Most of the arrests and detention have happened arbitrarily, either in violations of basic principles of due process or just incarcerating people while they were exercising their fundamental rights and freedoms. And all what I'm saying is fully documented throughout my reports. As of the 7th of October, we are seeing an apocalypse unfolding day after day. And it's not just me, the special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory, saying that. It's the UN Secretary General, the head of UNRWA, the head of UNICEF, the head of ICRC, the head of WHO. The United Nations are united in denouncing the violence and the catastrophe that is ongoing in the Gaza Strip. As it has been said, through 67 days of heavily bombardment, Israel has destroyed pretty much 70% of the civilian infrastructure in Gaza. 70% means most homes, most houses are no longer there, are no longer accessible, are no longer functional. So it's gone. Israel has been bombing residential buildings, universities, hospitals. Only 9 of the 29 hospitals in the Gaza Strip are still functioning. And ambulances, churches, mosques, bakeries, the electricity power plant, the desalinization system. So it's a bombing which has realized into mass destruction of the civilian infrastructure. And on top of it, there are over 18,000 people killed, 8,000 of whom are children. 60% of the victims in Gaza alone, we are not talking of the West Bank yet, but in Gaza alone, 60%, 70% of the victims are women and children. And again, if you look at what the Israeli authorities, the Israeli military is saying, is that through this military operation, they managed to kill 2,000 Hamas operatives. 2,000 Hamas operatives. It means that 90% of the victims to Hamas and to Israel. Rather the contrary, Western countries, and Europe is no exception, have continued to supply Israel with weapons. And on top of all this, let's look at the legal context. And of course, there are 50,000 people injured, needing either surgery or needing immediate cure. But there are no hospitals where to take them, because not only the health infrastructure has been completely devastated, the hospitals who are still open, they are mostly sheltering IDPs, internally displaced people, and they do not have materials to operate. I mean, I've heard doctors, surgeons saying that they were amputating children who died out of pain. In 2023, someone who's considered in Europe, and Israel is considered the only democracy in the Middle East, well, registered this, that the only democracy in the Middle East was kept under siege 2.2 million people, forcing them to also live under Hamas rule, because it's thanks to Israel that there was no possibility to change the ruling system in the Gaza Strip. They've suffered 5 major wars, which had already caused 4,000 people. This is the number of those who were killed in the previous wars in Gaza in 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, and 2022. 4,000 people killed, including 1,000 children, just to put things again in context. And now, the only democracy in the Middle East has prevented food, medicines, fuel, and water entering the most entrapped place on earth, the most heavily populated place on earth, while it was heavily bombed. And doctors have amputated kids without anesthetics, and kids have died out of pain. Out of pain. There are newborns who will not be able to be carried out of the incubators from Al-Shifa hospital, and they were given assurance by the army that they would be they would be accommodated into other incubators. They were left to die on a hospital's beds while the Israeli army took over. This is happening in Gaza under our watch. Clearly, there are no journalists allowed in, together with humanitarian aid. But this is the reality. This is the reality in the Gaza Strip. How many more people need to die? This is already more than twice the number of people who were slaughtered in Srebrenica. We said never again, then again, and we were not able to help to prevent a genocide. Now, together with other special rapporteurs, I've raised the alarm, I've sounded the alarm at least 3 times that there was a risk of genocide, serious risk of genocide, really serious risk of genocide unfolding, and no response. What I see European countries doing, some European countries have defunded Palestinian and Israeli organizations at the most critical point in time for them to keep on operating in a context where they are more needed than ever. Well, European governments are defunding Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations that are governments who are considering defunding UNRWA. At the time, UNRWA is the only artery able to deliver the much needed humanitarian aid. This is the lack of humanity that we have reached. Frankly, in as much as I've never been optimistic in the sense that I know the plight of the world I come from, because I'm also European, and I know that we carry a plight. 500 years of colonialism have left such a huge imprint on us, as someone says. Yes, indeed. We cannot see the other than through the color of the skin, most probably. But otherwise, how to explain the double standard? How to explain that after 60 days of heavy bombardment in Gaza, almost 20,000 people killed, the entire Gaza Strip completely devastated, having the government and the military completely inundated, engulfed by genocidal statements, and the entire Israeli society crossed by genocidal statements north to south, east to west. How come that in the face of all this, the only thing that some European countries, my own, Italy, France, and Germany, the only thing they can come up with is to sanction Hamas? Great, sanction Hamas, but why not to sanction Israel as well? Sanction both warring parties, because both of them have committed crimes and continue to commit crimes. There shouldn't be double standard. There shouldn't be selectivity in moral outrage and selectivity in the application of international law. And let me go to almost the last point. Before I do that, I want to shift the attention to the West Bank, because not many are talking about that. But while a genocide might be unfolding in the Gaza Strip, the reality in the West Bank and East Jerusalem is not much better, because there is no Hamas military presence there, and still Israeli armed forces and armed settlers, including with weapons being distributed by an Israeli minister, have been killing almost 300 people in 2 months, on top of the 300 who had already been killed this year in the West Bank. And of course, now everyone is a Hamas terrorist. It's so convenient to label everyone as a Hamas terrorist. And where is the presumption of innocence? Anyone? And I'm shocked. I'm shocked because even at this critical moment, the Israeli government has the stamina to continue to advance its annexation of the West Bank. I mean, there was 4 days ago, a plan was, no, actually 2 weeks ago, the plan to expand the budget for colonies was announced. And there has been no real criticism from anyone. And now the plan for the expansion of the settlement has been announced. And yesterday, the regional advisor for NRC, which informs the European Union and individual countries on a regular basis, confirmed that the annexation plan is formally ongoing with extension of greater parts of the West Bank falling under civil jurisdiction of Minister Bezalel Smotrich. So here's the situation. One of the victims of this conflict is international law. It's being killed forever. In a sense, it's very difficult for me as a lawyer to envisage how I will be teaching international law anymore as of this, in the sense that all the remedial function, the preventive function of international law has been crushed in such a short period of time that we cannot say it happened and we didn't know what we were doing. We knew very well what we were doing and what we were not doing. So, and international law has been betrayed and because it has been defended in all its. Can you hear me? The right of self-defense that has been invoked, but in an inappropriate fashion, because Israel had the right to protect itself. There is no question about that. Israel has had, and it will always have, the right to protect its territory, its citizens, and its interests in Israel. But it cannot do two things: to claim self-defense while occupying another people, oppressing another people, and which has a right of self-determination, we shall be reminded, but also it cannot, and this is established jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice. The right of self-defense is not just the right to protect itself, it's the right to wage a war. Israel doesn't have the right to wage a war against the population it occupies. It keeps under belligerent occupation. So, Russia aggresses Ukraine, attacks Ukraine. Ukraine has a right to defend itself militarily against Russia. Here, we are not in a Russia-Ukraine situation. The Gaza Strip is not an hostile entity. The Gaza Strip is still occupied under international law, and I'm happy, very happy, to explain it over and over as much as needed, because I understand that this is a sensitive issue. So in the Q&A, feel free to ask about this. And again, so the right of self-defense has been abused. But again, even if there was the right of self-defense, there are rules in war. There are rules in the use of military force. And Israel would have violated those rules even if, again, there had been the right to wage a war. Because there is a principle of distinction between an obligation to distinguish between civilian objects and military objects, between civilians and military personnel. And this obligation has been failed more dramatically than before. It had already been failed before. Again, look at the 2008 war, Cast-led operation, which was very violent, 2 months, I think, December, January, 480 victims. In 2014, there were over 1,400 victims, 500 of whom were children, in a war that lasted much shorter than the previous one. So there has been a flexing of Israel's interpretation of the principle of distinction, of the principle of precaution and proportionality in military actions. And it's undisputable that there is the intention to harm the civilians because of, look at three things that for me are very telling. First of all, humanitarian aid has been used as a tool of war because at the moment Gaza was already under blockade, which is a collective punishment, which is a war crime before the 7th of October. many people in Gaza were dependent on aid. 80% of them were relying on UN aid, and 50% of the active population was unemployed because of the blockade. But let's leave it aside. What Israel does as of the 7th of October, it prevents the unfettered entry of water, energy, food, and medicines that were absolutely needed. This might lead to intentional starvation. This is what we have warned independent experts of the UN since day 5 of this war. The second thing, Israel has almost entirely decapitated the health system in Gaza. Of the 29 hospitals that were active, 9 are still there and cannot function, as I said. Ambulances, medical personnel killed or disappeared, but mostly killed. Together with UN officers, this has been the most lethal conflict for the United Nations. They have lost 130 people, 130 staff members, 80 journalists. But again, for me, the most striking figures remain 8,000 children. Can we comprehend the horror of this? 8,000 children in 60 days. And counting, counting, because it's not over yet. The more you keep on thinking about what to do, the more people will die. And then the third thing, there have been, the bombs, the weapons used, and again, there are already Israeli journalists investigating this. They call what has happened an assassination factory, saying that artificial intelligence has been used to determine power targets, meaning not just where the military were, but where everyone being on Hamas payroll, basically, being targets. And also there have been the bombing of hospitals, the bombing of UNRWA infrastructure while they were sheltering civilians, and this is on top of the war against the UN and UNRWA in particular at such a tragic time. But also think of the bombing of Jabalia camp. The Jabalia camp, there were 400 residents, including hostages, Israeli hostages. Israel knew who was in the camp and bombed it no matter what, because there was one Hamas person there. So this is the context of this military operation. There is a genocidal call. There is a very disturbing practice that might amount to genocide. The reality and the capacity Israel has are there. So what the European Union is waiting to intervene, I'm not sure. But voila, this is what I wanted to share with you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Before I give the floor to my colleagues, first of all, I'd like to thank you for being with us. Even though you had to connect virtually, it was very difficult for you to be able to be here in person. So thank you for being with us. I understand that you're ill, so I really wanted to thank you for still joining us today. It's a real privilege to have you here. And we hope to see you in person as soon as possible. Now I'll give the floor to my colleagues, MEPs, so that they can make any comments or questions. I'll start with the Vice Chair, Margaret Auken.
Thank you very much, Francesca. I think everybody in this room here, something wrong? Everybody in the room here, I think will agree with you. So I think also all of us are looking for what to do. I would just add to one of the things I just read, that they also try now to flow the tunnels with seawater, and that would be an ecological disaster. If that is true. And I don't know if you've heard about that, because I thought that it was prevented by international intervention not to do that, in order to have a chance to restore Gaza after the war, which of course there must be an after the war. I have a few questions to you on this here. First, I was yesterday discussing with somebody, not in the plenary, on the ICC, and there I was told that the prosecutor in the ICC is not much worse. He doesn't really take into account the settlements, and if that is not done, then of course it will be a very vague court to go to. But I've just asked what expectations you have to the ICC if things will move there. And then the other question is, yesterday I raised in the plenary debate one of the possibilities the EU have to do something which could be real. That is that if we stop all trade with settlements, which is, and that's my point, illegal in all member states. We don't need a common EU position, which we need when we need sanctions. There we need to have a unanimous position, which makes it very difficult. But using legal means, and it is in no member state of the EU legal to have trade with somebody where the products are coming from stolen land. And I think that the very moment Israel cannot profit at all from settlements as they can now, then it can be, and I think it's the very moment a step is taken, and not only words, things have a chance to change. But I would just say I'm very, very pessimistic for the moment, because UN is let out, and the way that the majority in Israel and Israeli government is just neglecting the UN and neglecting, as you said very clearly, the international law, and they don't find it bothering that they are doing it. But I think we need to have as many ideas at the table, which legal steps can be taken, because they don't need unanimous position, and some of them should be quite easy to take, because for the moment EU is acting illegal with having this trade, and that could be a strong step. Thank you.
César.
Caesar.
Muy bien, gracias.
Thank you very much. Manu? I just have a brief observation, a general observation for the parliamentary services. We always seem to have technical issues in this meeting room. I don't know if it's the case for other meetings, but whenever there's a meeting on Palestine, we always seem to have these technical issues. Now, in this case, the technical issue seems to be on Francesca's side, unfortunately, just to make that clear. But yes, indeed, we do always seem to have issues in this room, but in this case, it's not coming from our side. Very well. I just wanted to say that. So I'd like to thank the interpreters for their work, particularly today, because it makes them work much more complicated when there are technical issues. Now, first of all, on behalf of the Social Democrats group in this delegation, I'd like to commend your work within the United Nations, and I'd like to commend the work of the Secretary General, who's been vilified by Israel. I think it's important to say that. And I think the invocation of Article 99 and his calls for a ceasefire are really honourable. Now, you mentioned the EU and states party and member states action, and it seems that von der Leyen actually carried out a rather pathetic visit, and there have been unjustified charges levelled by her. I also wanted to say that in relation to this conflict, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, and Spain led by the socialist government of Mr. Sanchez, have made it clear what the EU's path should be. Some member states may follow, but in any case, the Social Democrats seem to have followed the calls from the left in the parliament. Now, a couple of more comments before I put to you my questions. Josep Borrell said that we had to consider sanctions against Hamas and Israel. You mentioned this in your intervention. Perhaps you could give us more detail on this. Now, I was talking about this with Manu Pinera just now. We need to talk about the root cause. The occupation needs to come to an end, since we've seen this since February in the West Bank. And we're seeing killings linked with this settlement. This is the root cause. Now, of course, the aim is to reach a two-state solution and not a sort of Swiss cheese solution for the Palestinian state. It needs to be full and complete. Now, when it comes to hospitals and children, the Spanish Prime Minister, Mr. Sanchez, who holds the presidency of the Council, said that there's a lack of humanity. And we mustn't stop saying this. It's pure evil. And there's a lack of empathy from many members here in Parliament. Here today, you don't see anyone from the right in this room, in this delegation. So my questions are, after hearing Joe Biden yesterday, do you think that there may be a change possible at the US level? Could there be a shift in the US towards voting a ceasefire, including Article 99? Is there any possibility of that happening? And secondly, could Netanyahu, now of course I'm not going to ask about the state of Israel, but rather the government of Netanyahu, could they lose the support of Joe Biden's government? Thank you. That's all I had to ask.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for your presentation. And I mean, the words you use are what we're seeing everywhere: the apocalypse, the numbers of innocent children. You said 8,080 days gone, 18,000 civilians gone, murdered. You know, it's such a cruel war. It's unbelievably cruel what's happening. And I'm an Irish MEP with the Green Group. In Ireland, we have, for a number of years, we had a piece of legislation on the table brought into the Irish Senate, which I co-signed with Senator Francis Black, calling for a halt to the importation of goods from occupied territories. But it was really drafted specifically a number of years ago to focus on the situation in Palestine. So, you know, I know that we have requested a number of times now over the last weeks that legislation should be brought back into the Irish Parliament and to, you know, hopefully pass. So at least we can take some leadership in that regard. What I want to ask you, because of your own background, international law, there's a petition at the moment in Ireland which has been put out by change.org, and Stop the Genocide, and it's calling on the Irish government to uphold its responsibilities under the UN Genocide Convention and bring an immediate end to Israel's unconscionable onslaught against the Palestinian people. Now,
genocide scholars, studies scholars, UN human rights experts, international lawyers across the world have advised that there is a clear evidence of genocide being committed against Palestinians. And Ireland is a party to the Genocide Convention, which imposes a legal obligation upon states to prevent genocide and act in the event that there's a serious risk of genocide. So the petition is going around, and my question to you is, you know, is this something Ireland can do? Can Ireland bring forward, you know, this a convention? And you know, what advice would you give in that regard? And then, in addition, it states in the petition to impose sanctions on Israel, and calling for such sanctions to be adopted by the EU. So again, we talked about sanctions against Hamas, sanctions against Israel. But you know, again, what would be your advice to us MEPs in terms of what you think we could do to push this with our own countries and governments? Thanks.
Gracias, Grace.
Thank you, João.
Yes, Manu. Thank you, Francesca, for being here with us. I've had the pleasure to see you many times before in interviews in mainstream media, let's say, deconstructing the dehumanization of Palestine and of the Palestinians and of the situation, and deconstructing many lies that unfortunately are being put forward also, and mainly through mainstream media, regarding the current situation. And so my first comment was to a word of appreciation to the role that you, of course, and many others play in granting that the truth is reachable for the public. And it has been so important, yours and others' contributions to the massive mobilization of the public in solidarity with Palestine, which I would say, although still falling short, let's say, of what is the need, but is amongst the, let's say, the causes of even those pauses that were implemented. Highly insufficient, but if it hadn't been, let's say, the massive popular mobilization, for sure, we wouldn't even have seen those. And so this means we need to keep our voices heard and gaining place in the streets. I would make 2 or 3 questions to you. One similar to what Margaret asked, but not regarding ICC, but whether ICJ is having any initiative to gather information on the crimes that are being committed and preparing any sort of action towards Israel. The other question, you mentioned, even as a lawyer, that you find it hard to see how international law will be upheld after this this conflict, if I understood correctly from your words. Although we have seen in the past multiple other situations where international law has also been surpassed by main powers in previous wars. The Iraqi war, for instance, we could name others, or the Yugoslavia or whatever. But it's true that this is a so evident situation that it's hard to understand. How is it possible, for instance, for a country like the United States? We can understand, but why it vetoes a ceasefire in the UN Security Council? So the question was, following the 99th article called by the Secretary General of the UN, what's left in terms of the legal resources? Let's say that those that can intervene, namely within the UN, have to intervene. And the third question, it's perhaps a more rhetorical question, but relevant. Only 9 countries in the EU recognize Palestine. What would be, do you think, what would be the circumstances if, apart from the propaganda, let's say, we are always talking about the two-state solutions, the need to recognize Palestine, but then the main powers and 19 countries in the EU do not recognize, 18 countries in the EU, and the EU itself does not recognize Palestine. It's evident that that is a step that is absolutely needed, the recognition without conditionalities of the state of Palestine. What would change if that would happen, in your view?
Gracias, Joao.
Thank you, Joao. Mark.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Ms. Albanese. I can only echo the thanks for your role as UN Special Rapporteur and also the work carried out by some of your colleagues who are playing an extremely important role today, such as Mr. Gutierrez and the United Nations in general, as a body, through the vote yesterday at the General Assembly, after the American veto at the Security Council. I think yesterday's vote was extremely important, and that sends a clear message. And today, the EU is not able to call for a ceasefire because of for an associated country. And I think that the aspect is important because the European Union has a specific characteristics here. We are directly linked to Israel. We have a number of association agreements, and we have an association agreement with Israel today that we don't have with every country in the world. That means that there's a responsibility here, a special responsibility for the EU. And that leads me to my question. So there's obviously a more specific issue here with regard to delivery of arms that go through EU countries. In Belgium, we often talk about this issue. For example, there are protests in Antwerp, at the port. But more generally speaking, the association agreement, EU-Israel, gives Israel certain privileges. It gives Israel access to EU funds. Continuing with these privileges today, in some way or another, does that mean that we could become accomplices? Are we participating in the crimes that are being committed? I think this is extremely important because we are discussing this at the time where Madame von der Leyen went to Israel and she forgot to mention the need to uphold international humanitarian law. But the European Union should also consider this issue. What is the responsibility that we have, the potential liability perhaps? So that would be my first question. My second is less legal in nature, but you are the UN rapporteur and you're in contact with a number of players, not just the EU. Now, the EU doesn't like being accused of double standards, but I feel like in many parts of the world, that is the conclusion that many are drawing. Today we have international law, and the image conveyed by the European Union is suffering. The EU credibility is suffering. So my question would be the following. Now, this might not be within your remit, but today, do you feel that the credibility of the EU as an actor who defends human rights and international humanitarian law is suffering as a result of what is happening, based on your contacts that you have with other actors?
Gracias, Mark. Ahora voy a hablar yo, no en calidad de...
Thank you, Mark. Now I'm going to speak not as chair of the delegation, but as an MEP for the left. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Ms. Albanesse, for that very clear and comprehensive presentation. It helps us to keep up our hope and also our efforts, because the UN's work is key at a time when we're seeing that it's not fulfilling the role that it was designed for, not due to a lack of will, but due to the veto of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and the systematic use thereof by the United States in the event of any resolution in this situation. This doesn't mean that the UN's work and these mechanisms aren't essential. They need to be improved upon. So I think that your presentation was very clear. And I also wish to join in commending the efforts of the Secretary General, as mentioned by Cesar. He has spoken with a great deal of clarity and stated clearly that the nightmare, I think those were the words that he used, going on in the Gaza Strip were not just a humanitarian crisis, but a crisis or a cause for humanity. It wasn't a tsunami or an earthquake or natural disaster. It was a genocide, a massacre, an attempt at a third Nakba. The 2,300,000 survivors in the Gaza Strip are being pushed to displacement, moving towards Egypt. This is what is going on. And Netanyahu's genocide is also linked to the settlements in the West Bank. Just a few weeks ago, there was the celebration of the first settlement in the Gaza Strip. And they're not hiding this. They're clearly stating that they have complete disregard for international law. The president, I can't remember what his name is, the president of Israel, says the chair, Erzo, actually said that there are no civilians in the Gaza Strip, that the 2.3 million people are military targets. But that's not the case. Saying that in itself is a war crime. The Minister for War, or so-called defense in Israel, I can't remember his name, but they clearly and publicly told soldiers to go in and do whatever they need to do with full support of the government. This is a clear violation of the Geneva Convention, and even the Nazis, of course, they didn't respect the laws of war, but they didn't say it with the amount of impunity that the Israeli regime seems to be displaying. Preventing access to electricity supply, to water, to medicine, to fuel, for a population who, as Ms. Albanesse said, has been under blockade since 2007, amounts to collective punishment equating to Warsaw. This is a war crime. Bombardment of civilians, indiscriminate assassinations. You also mentioned 18,000 individuals and counting, but there are still thousands under the rubble, and there's very little hope that they will survive. We're talking about a situation in which 70% of those people are children and women. The non-accidental bombing of hospitals and UN schools. The Israeli government have clearly stated that they're bombing hospitals intentionally because there are Hamas targets hiding in them. And this has led to children dying, and I would even go so far as saying that those were the lucky ones because the others have to suffer. If we were told about this, we wouldn't believe it. We've seen premature babies being left behind in hospitals and incubators. It's impossible to fathom what's going on, but we're hearing witness accounts from doctors. These are not accidents, they're premeditated actions. Bombardments against children who were attempting to leave the Al-Shifa hospital. And the bombing of the Red Crescent vans. What can we call this? Can we still claim that this is the right to self-defense? Is there no shame? We heard the President of the European Commission today talking still about the right to self-defense. So could someone please tell me who Israel is defending itself against now? The right to self-defense is limited to repelling an attack. That's where it stops. What Israel is doing is perpetrating a genocide. And if we don't call a spade, I think Mark put this question to you about liability or responsibility. But if we don't call a spade, then we have a moral responsibility at the very least. If we're not clear about the fact that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide, then we have a moral responsibility. And a Holocaust was committed against 6 million Jews back in the day, and now we seem to be accomplices in another Holocaust. Palestinians are being assassinated with F-16 missiles launched by Israel. How long can we stand by while this happens? Another colleague mentioned Joe Biden and asked whether Joe Biden's position might shift. I'm not sure about that, but I know that whilst making these statements, in the meantime, Joe Biden has sent over I don't know how many bombs, which will ultimately kill Palestinians. He doesn't really care about the situation of the Palestinians. It's an internal affair. And the government of the United States is now seeing a popular uprising, and that's why they are now changing their stance. So it's up to us to push for that mobilization at grassroots level. My colleague also mentioned the ICC. I have been to the ICC, and I spoke with the prosecutor on Palestinian affairs, and I handed in a dossier on crimes committed. But it was reporting on crimes of such a high level that it was divided up into 8 sections, exposing violations of human law, humanitarian law, UN charters, the Convention of Geneva, among others. And I asked the prosecutor about the double standards here. We've talked about double standards in the EU, but I also asked the prosecutor of the ICC about double standards at that level too. Because in the case of Ukraine, an international arrest warrant was issued immediately against Putin. Why is this not happening for Israel? I think, well, he said to me, that there are political issues that simply cannot be explained in further detail. But there are some issues that can be explained, and that is that observers and investigators of the ICC were allowed into Ukraine to see the crimes that have been committed there and to hear the witness accounts, whereas in Gaza, Israel won't let us enter the territory and carry out investigations, and that impedes the ICC's work. Israel has not let in international observers or observers from the ICC, let alone some journalists. Now, just some last few words about the hostages. They should be released eventually, if you'll allow me to finish. We demand also that Israel release the thousands of Palestinians detained in Israeli prisons under the pretense of administrative detention. Thank you once again, Ms. Albanesse.
Can you hear me?
Una cuestión formal. Es
Can I
que
answer the questions?
Un momento, Francesca.
Just a minute, Francesca.
solamente porque en la intervención del
In your statement, as an MEP, perhaps we could correct this in the minutes, you stated that the EU was responsible for the Holocaust 80 years ago, but the EU didn't exist at that time, so please, let's correct that. I meant Europe, says the chair. But actually it was the Nazis, says Caesar. Please, go ahead, Francesca.
So, thank you very much. It was very interesting to listen to you and to receive your questions. And I'm also sorry for the audio. I understand that it's not very clear. I came back from Europe with fever, so yeah, I couldn't leave home. But however, I will speak slowly. Hopefully, it will be easier to catch up with what I'm saying. So, concerning settlements, I've met you before and said that I found already puzzling the way the EU was dealing with settlements, because for me, labeling settlement products and still allowing them in our markets is not enough. To be very, very conservative is not enough, because goods which emanate from a crime should not be on European markets, full stop. But also, I would like now to really push forward. Can we really distinguish between Israel and Israel's settlement enterprise? It's not just the settlement and what they produce. You wouldn't have the settlements if it was not for Israel's will to occupy and colonize the land that remains to the Palestinians. So I think that in the bigger scheme of things, we can also accept that it's time to use a more coherent and more integral paradigm with international, a more coherent and consistent paradigm with international law than the hypersensitized one which has always been used. In the case of Russia, the sanctions were not imposed just because of the war, but were also imposed because of the occupation. It's the occupation that made the relationship with Russia before the war problematic. But however, without going into that, which is a big issue, and yes, I agree that the Russia-Ukraine war and the swift response that the European Union has given the conflict compared to the paralysis that it, but there is no time to be sorry, I'm back. So, and nothing has been really useful because words of condemnation are not useful. So I don't think that the problem can be limited to the settlements. It should be up to you to consider, but in fact, it's especially as of October, new government's coalition agreement to annex large swathes of the West Bank, and which is ongoing as we speak. The war in Gaza has not restrained Israeli government's ability to expand its budget 3 weeks ago and its housing units like a few days ago in the occupied West Bank. So while we debate whether the settlements, whether we should stop this, and Europe should stop the trade with the settlement keep on growing. So I think that it's time to consider sanctions against Israel, full stop, because it's the settlements are a state and so either we now I hear also, and let me answer the question. A question concerning the ICC here. There has been an increasing emphasis and increasing attention on settlers' violence. And I'm worried about that because it seems to shift including by the prosecutor of the ICC, it seems to shift the attention from the enterprise, from the settlement enterprise, which is the backbone of the occupation that Israel has maintained 56 years, from that to individuals who are committing violence. So while the risk is there, I think that there is also a point, as the prosecutor is doing, to focus on settler violence itself, because by itself, the fact of having armed settlers persecuting, harassing, and threatening Palestinians is making the Jordan Valley, entire areas of the Jordan Valley, a desert. There are over 20 communities that have packed their bags and gone. They have left the Jordan Valley. They have left South Hebron Hills because there is one thing Palestinians cannot lose. It's their children. So unlike the image that is often portrayed in Western countries of Palestinians ready to sacrifice their children, like human shields. No, they don't. They don't. They sacrifice themselves for their land, but not their children. And so they pack and go. And this is what's happening. So yes, steps have to be taken. And the second question was about Article 99 that was invoked by the Secretary General. I agree with you. I stand with the Secretary General now more than ever. I've been very critical of him in the beginning because I think that what we needed was leadership. And I know it was difficult, but special rapporteurs have used the same strong voice. This is not just me. I have 35 colleagues, meaning 40% of the special rapporteurs have been with me since the very beginning, again, denouncing the risk of genocide, denouncing the abuse of international law, and asking for a ceasefire. So we have, even when we saw that the special that the Secretary General invoked, considering that we are 50 experts in various parts of the world, in 12 hours, we put together a statement addressed to the Secretary General, but also to the Security Council, with concrete recommendations of what should be the achievement. We wanted to help, and we said, I know that I disappeared. Okay, so I said, of course, there should be a ceasefire. Of course, because there is only one thing that will stop the slaughtering of civilians, of innocent people, and continuous forced displacement in Gaza, because as you can see, the northern Gaza has been emptied and people keep on being pushed toward the south, because I agree. I mean, and it's been very clear from the beginning, the intent here is to push as many people toward the Egyptian solutions that has been evoked, including before then the 7th of October. And yes, so there should be ceasefire. There should be unfettered entry of humanitarian aid, liberation of all hostages, liberation of all Palestinians arbitrarily deprived of their liberty. And there were already, President Pineda was evoking the Palestinians detained without charge and trial. There were 1,500 before the 7th of October. I was reading today that 4,000 Palestinians have been arrested in the last 2 months in the West Bank and East Jerusalem alone. It's immense. And also there are numerous allegations of mistreatment and allegations of torture being practiced against Palestinians under Israeli detention. So on top of all this, we have asked for a protective presence. And this is something I would really like you to consider. This is something that needs to start circulating in Europe. We need to have a protective presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. This is something that we ask in the interest of both Palestinians and Israelis, to save life and also as a step forward toward the future. Because again, there cannot be, the status quo is gone, is dead. We can keep on talking about a two-state solution, but as it was unrealistic on the 7th of October, it's even more realistic now, which doesn't mean that it shouldn't be a pursued solution, but it should be premised upon international law, which obliges the withdrawal of Israeli troops, the end of the colonization. It doesn't mean that all the settlers need to pack and go, need to be uprooted, but again, justice is to be done. So those who have committed crimes should not be allowed to stay, should be investigated and prosecuted. And those who want to stay, they will stay as Israeli with Palestinian citizenship, as there are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. But again, once the private land has been returned, while compensations have been made, etc. So we need to think in these terms. We need to look forward and not backward, and avoid the mistakes of the past. And one of the mistakes of the past was to avoid international law accurately. So again, a protective presence. And then, of course, there should be a reconstruction of Gaza. Israel cannot take control of the land in the Gaza Strip, as it's doing, because many soldiers were reported on record saying, we came instructed to destroy, displace, and settle. destroy, displace, and settle. What is this? Yes, again, Israel has denied the Nakba for 75 years, and now they are in full force calling for a second Nakba. But it should be the third, because there was already a second Nakba in 1967. So under the fog of war, Israel goes for mass forced displacement, but it goes with discrete forced displacement when there is no big war. So yes, there are measures, concrete measures that can be taken by the Security Council, by the General Assembly on a ceasefire. I mean, I see people say, yeah, but it's not binding. It's binding if people want it to be binding. In the sense, what else? Resolution 377, Uniting for Peace, which is a resolution that can be invoked when there is a veto hampering the possibility of the Security Council to function. So this should be the framework. But again, I encourage everyone to look at the voting pattern. I mean, I'm shocked to see that there are, okay, it's shameful to see countries which abstained, but it's even more shameful to see European countries which voted against the ceasefire. Seriously. I mean, again, I know that the problem is not in the room, but the question of justice in Israel and Palestine should be a cross-cutting one, should be one, let's put the people at the center and not Hamas or the current Israeli government. If we have the future of both Palestinian and Israelis at heart, and I do, we should think of like involving also people from the right, because clearly they are not helping the Israeli people at all. It's true that I'm very severe with European countries, but most of my frustration goes at the European Union in its plenary, because it's true there are countries and they should be acknowledged. Like Spain, Ireland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Portugal. They are the only ones who have shown, I mean, Norway is outside of the European Union, but also I would put Norway into the group as well, because in these desperate times, they've tried hard to advance a more principled discourse. I mean, Ireland is always the one who leads the chef de file and who leads the, like, in terms of advanced discourse, but also Spain has done incredible steps forward, and Belgium, in order to have also justice and accountability, which is amazing. And again, I think that this is the way to go. There is a need to distance ourselves from states who only seed war. Peace is made of peace. Peace is construed with peace and with the respect for international law. Like it or not, this is the only way forward that we can imagine. Otherwise, we just leave space for violence. The other question is there room for a change with this US? I don't see any real change in the US. I mean, there are individual statements made here and there that seem to be more a reaction to the gravity of the situation on the ground, but then each grave situation becomes the new normal and the benchmark against which to assess the next horrific phase. So I do not expect much right now. It might take months before the political situation changes in the US, but we shouldn't be waiting for that. I mean, we should recover, if not rediscover, as Europe. I mean, you as European Union, so European countries should rediscover their own morality, because the morality is completely lost. Yes, I was saying, what should I teach when I do meet students and I talk about international law? Not because it's true that there have been crimes after crimes, atrocity crimes after atrocity crimes. Again, of colonialism, and we are not even able to properly apologize. So no, I mean, the Srebrenica happened, and we were carrying on with our life, and so Rwanda, and so Sudan, and so the war in Yemen, etc., etc. What is different here? There are things that I think are different. First of all, it's really in real time, because the Palestinians, no matter what, without journalists, without many people on the ground, without electricity, they still recharge their phones battery with bicycles, and they share on social media what's happening. So they are still, as Edward Said was saying, the storyteller of their tragedy. I don't think that any other tragedy has happened in real time with this level of support, massive support by Western countries, because it's massive. It's not just the US. It's the US and many strong powers in Europe. And there is again, it's taking months for people to change their minds. And it's taking months for people to realize that what they have said, what they have recited for months was not in line with international law. And the third element, no people have been smeared, no people on earth. And I challenge anyone on this. I'm happy to be proven wrong. No people on earth in the last 75 years has been smeared as much as the Palestinians while being killed and being blamed. The Palestinians are killed, the Palestinians are blamed, and the Palestinians are smeared victims, because I'm sorry, Hamas committed horrific actions. I would be the first one celebrating to see Hamas leadership on the bench investigated for its crimes, first and foremost against the Palestinians.
¿Qué? ¿Qué? Francesca, tenemos que terminar en 3 minutos.
We have to end in 3 minutes, unfortunately, Francesca, because there's another meeting in this room. You have 3 minutes to sum up, to wrap up, if possible.
Yes. But so yes, I would like to see Hamas on the bench at the ICC, and it shall happen. But this needs a lot of political action. Just a second. Let me see what is needed for mobilization. I don't think I can cover it here. Maybe on double standards. Again, I do think that on the question of Palestine, the European Union's double standards are in public displays, and they are not the only one, but people in the global south look at Palestine like the litmus test of justice versus injustice. And it's not just Israel-Palestine, it's the West against the rest. So I'm sorry if I took too long to answer your questions. I got carried away. But happy to come back to you any other time you need.
Muchísimas gracias, Francesca. Se ha hecho corta, nos ha faltado tiempo en esto.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but we hope to hear from you at another time to continue discussing this. And we hope that that will be in a context within which this massacre will come to an end. And we hope that then we can look at the next steps moving forward, but we hope that it will come to an end as soon as possible. Thank you very much for being there, and thank you very much to the interpreters, who also thank you for your efforts and for having stayed a little bit longer. Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you taking part. And the technicians as well. Thank you very much. And thank you, Francesca.
Nos vemos pronto.
See you soon.